No, to hold it to such regard that it would be just as if they were going to be gathering together for the Feast of Trumpets. And again, it's a good lesson, I think, a good principle, that because the truth is we can do the same thing with coming to church. Not you guys, you're here tonight. So maybe just if someone happens to not be here tonight and they catch this online, or you can, say, well, Pastor Rob said you should have been at church. That's not what I'm saying. But look, we can do that. We can get with the familiar sort of routine and just, it doesn't become the priority it once was. Reading our Bibles maybe just doesn't become as important as it once was. Oh, I do it every day. It's okay if I just, sleep in today. Or prayer, or whatever those things are. Now, our hearts, the Lord's saying, our lives should prioritize those things just as much as Resurrection Sunday. Just as much as Christmas Day. Just as much as your birthday party. In fact, more. And so I think God is making that known here. Well, so from this now, he goes on, verse 4. He says, these are the feasts of the Lord, holy convocations which you shall proclaim at their appointed times. On the 14th day of the first month at twilight is the Lord's Passover. So again, 7 feasts would be yearly celebrated. And it says there are appointed times. There were specific times when these feasts were to be celebrated. For example, Passover, as we see there in verse 5, was to be the 14th day of the first month. Now, one more thing I want to clarify before we really get into the details of this. This is not January 14th. Today, we base our calendar, the world bases our calendar on what's called the Gregorian calendar. It's a solar calendar, right? We base it on how many days it takes for the earth to travel around the sun. However, the Jewish calendar in those days was based upon a lunar calendar. How many times the moon travels, around the earth. It was based on the phases of the moon. And the lunar calendar starts on the first lunar light after a new moon. So a new moon, you can't see the sun. The moment you can see a sliver of the moon's reappearance, that would indicate the first day of a new month. And each lunar month lasts about 29 to 30 days, depending on what time sort of the moon emerges. And so for the Jewish calendar, the year began not in January, but it starts in spring, usually somewhere around March or April. And usually around is because, again, it doesn't completely line up with our solar calendar, and which is why these holidays can vary so much every year as to what date they fall upon. So the first feast here, there was the 14th day of the first month, again, in the spring. So think maybe March or April time, usually around the time of Easter. And it was the Feast of Passover. A feast I'm sure many of us have some degree of familiarity with. It's one in which we read all the ins and outs of back when we were in Exodus 12, when the very first Passover was celebrated. And it's still a feast that is widely celebrated by Jews today, which is amazing. Just to think 3,500 years later, this holy day is still being remembered and celebrated by millions of people around the world. It's absolutely fascinating. And so what is this feast about? Well, remember, it's a feast just essentially it's commemorating God's mercy upon Israel when they were in Egypt. And specifically when God protected Israel from the 10th plague, which was the death of the firstborn son. Remember, God calls them to sacrifice a lamb, and to take the blood of that sacrificed lamb, to paint the blood upon the doorposts of their homes, and that whoever was in those homes covered by that blood, when the death of the firstborn son plague swept over the land, that they would be spared of judgment, that those in the home would not die, that the plague would pass over, the judgment would pass over their homes. And so as they did this, the Exodus tells us, Israel was spared. But Egypt wasn't, because the Egyptians weren't following God. And so this was the moment, this last plague, when this happens. From it, Pharaoh, remember, he finally lets Israel go from their bondage. That was the first Passover. And yet from that day, God called Israel to celebrate every year this day with a feast. That every year, in memory of and commemoration of what God did, they would slaughter a lamb. They would eat of it on this Passover day. And more, they would pass down the testimony of this miracle to the next generation so that they would never forget what God did, the mercy of God, to spare them of this judgment. In fact, in the Passover celebrations done today, in the Seder meals, one of the common traditions that they have is the father of the home begins the night by saying, we're celebrating the Passover, and the kids in the home, sort of a fun thing they do, but the kids all respond by saying, why is this night different from all other nights? Sort of the traditional sort of speech there. And then from that moment, the father then retells the account of the first Passover. If you know anything about it, it's a very special celebration. It's a very joyous celebration. And as we'll touch on later, one in which so powerfully points us to Jesus. There's so many elements. We won't go through them all. Really can't get into them all tonight. But so many different elements of the Passover. You see Jesus all over it. But this is the first feast of the year. This is the first celebration. It's a celebration of God's mercy. A celebration of his sparing of judgment on his people through the blood sacrifice of a lamb. Well, it goes on, verse 6. It says, and on the 15th day of the same month is the feast of unleavened bread to the Lord. 7 days you must eat unleavened bread. On the first day you shall have a holy convocation. You shall do no customary work on it, but you shall offer an offering made by fire to the Lord for 7 days. The 7th day shall be a holy convocation. You shall do no customary work on it. So the second feast was to begin the day after Passover, the 15th of the first month. And we see it was to last 7 days. It was to be a week long. And it was known as the Feast of Unleavened Bread. So essentially it was a 7-day long fast from leavened foods. Remember, it's like a yeast. It puffs up breads and grains, and there's all different types of things that would do that. Sometimes they'd add milk or eggs and so forth. None of that was permitted in the eating of bread and foods during this week. And in fact, during this time, all leaven was to be removed from their homes. They were to sweep their counters, their closets, to make sure none of it was in there, for all of it to be gone. And again, to abstain from eating leavened products, right? No fluffy muffins, no brownies, none of the delicious foods that we too often indulge in our society, at least not puffed up in the way that we would have them. And so they were to abstain from that. And also we see the first and 7th day of this feast were to be treated as if they were Sabbaths. So no work was to be permitted on those days. They were considered holy days that they were supposed to remember and observe. And this feast also ties all the way back to, and it was first established in the Exodus event. So the day after the 10th plague, the day after Passover, God calls Israel to do this very thing that we're reading of here, way back in Exodus 13. And there in Exodus 13, he also gives them not just the instructions of what to do, as we see, but why God called them to this celebration. Exodus 13:14 says it this way. It says, so it shall be when your son asks you in time to come, saying, what is this? Mom, why are you throwing out all the cake? Why are you throwing out all the delicious foods? It says that you shall say to him, by strength of hand, the Lord brought us out of Egypt, out of the house of bondage. So the feast was meant, or the fast was meant to recognize and for them to realize that God was the one who delivered them out of Egypt. Not Moses, not the strength of their mass population, not their abilities. It wasn't that they had an army who was able to overthrow and so forth. No, God did it with his hand. And the idea of the unleavened bread points to that. We've talked about this before. Leaven essentially is an external agent used to puff up some substance. But in essence, it's making something which was once pure, once unadulterated, now tainted by this leaven. And so the idea of eating unleavened bread in celebration was this, that the idea was that God and only God is the one who delivered us from Egypt. Nothing more, no one more. It wasn't God and Moses. It wasn't God and Aaron. It wasn't God and Aaron's rod. God's the one who did the work. God purely holy did it. And he wanted them to realize this in this symbolic representation of nothing was added. Purely the Lord delivered us. Another thing about leaven, we talked about this previously, is that it also is often a picture in the scriptures of sin. And so the idea being God and only God removed the bondage of the sin that was upon them. Here they were suffering under the sinfulness, the bondage of Egypt, of the world. And yet God is the one who, by his mighty hand, delivered them from this. So not only God celebrating, not only were they to celebrate God's mercy as seen in the Passover feast where he passed over judgment, but more, his redemption, his salvation, his deliverance, represented in the Feast of Unleavened Bread. We get to verse 9. It says, "And the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, Speak to the children of Israel and say to them, When you come into the land which I give to you and reap its harvest, then you shall bring a sheaf of the first fruits of your harvest to the priest. He shall wave the sheaf before the Lord to be accepted on your behalf. On the day after the Sabbath, the priest shall wave it. And you shall offer on that day, when you wave the sheaf, a male lamb of the first year, without blemish, as a burnt offering to the Lord. Its grain offering shall be 2/10 of an ephah of fine flour mixed with oil, an offering made by fire to the Lord for a sweet aroma. And its drink offering shall be wine, 1/4 of a hin. You shall eat neither bread, nor parched grain, nor fresh grain, until the same day that you have brought an offering to your God. It shall be a statute forever throughout your generations in all your dwellings." So this third feast was called the Feast of the First Fruits. It's also identified in the scriptures as the Feast of Harvest. Now, don't let the name confuse you. It's not harvest in the way we today think of harvest time. We think of fall is the harvest season. No, this would have been a spring harvest, and I'll explain that more in just a bit. But from verse 11, we see that it was celebrated on the day after the Sabbath, after the Passover. So this would have been celebrated during the Feast of Unleavened Bread, during that 7-week period, or 7-day period, that the day after the Sabbath, so the first Sunday after the Passover. It was a day to celebrate the budding of fruits in the springtime. It was a day to celebrate food, provision, sustenance, life essentially, provided from God to his people. It's important to note, this particular feast, it tells us in Exodus 23, they didn't start celebrating it until after Israel entered into the promised land. Because remember, during the 40 years, they weren't planting anything, right? Manna was falling from heaven. They were eating quail. That was God's provision for them. He says, when you get into the land flowing of milk and honey, a fertile land, not a desert wilderness, you're going to pop seeds into the ground and grapes the size of watermelons are going to come out, right? It's going to be a flourishing land where your sustenance, your provision from me is going to come through the fruit of the crops. And so once they were to come into the land was when they were supposed to start experiencing and celebrating this Feast of First Fruits. They would plant the seeds, they would water them, they'd start growing, and flowers would form, and then from that fruit would form, and it was at the not birthing, but what's the word, Jason? Cultivating, the emergence of the first fruits, budding, thank you, is when they would celebrate this feasts. And so this was the timing, and that would be this time of the year, and this is when God would have them celebrate it. And it was celebrated by taking some of the first fruits as offering them up as a sacrifice and worship to God. So um, this was the feast, and actually, it's also a principle, again, just carried into the New Testament. The idea of giving God the first fruits of his provisions. It's one in which we as a church, God calls us to as followers in Christ. And for example, in 1 Corinthians 16, Paul says, "Now concerning the collection for the saints, as I have given orders to the church of Galatia, so must you do also." He says, "On the first day of the week, let each one of you lay something aside, storing up as he may prosper, that there may be no collections when I come." So Paul's instruction in giving, in financial giving of the church, was set aside something on the first day of the week. Give the first fruits of your provision to God. Because the principle carried from Old Testament to New is the same throughout, and the principle is twofold. Number one, God is worthy not just of our leftovers, but of our best. It's not just like, oh, well, if I have something to give after all my time and energy and resources, whatever I have left, God, I'll check my pockets, I'll give you some of it. No, to give him our best. And secondly, the principle is it's a demonstration of trust in God. That even before I take of this fruit for my own provision, I know, Lord, you are my provider, and you are first in my life, even before my own wants and needs. And so before anything else I might, invest into or take of, I'm seeking first to glorify you and thank you for your provision above all other things. That was the idea, that was the sentiment, that was to be the heart expression in the celebration of this feast. And so that's what the Lord called Israel to, this feast of the first fruits. Well, we get to verse 15. It says, "And you shall count for yourselves from the day after the Sabbath," so from that day, the day of first fruits, from that day that you brought the sheaf of the wave offering, 7 Sabbaths shall be completed. Count 50 days to the day after the 7th Sabbath. Then you shall offer a new grain offering to the Lord. You shall bring from your dwellings 2 wave loaves of 2/10 of an ephah. They shall be of fine flour. They shall be baked with leaven. Interesting, the only sacrifice with leaven. They are the first fruits to the Lord. And you shall offer with the bread 7 lambs of the first year without blemish, 1 young bull, 1 and 2 rams. They shall be as a burnt offering to the Lord, with their grain offering and their drink offering, an offering made by fire for a sweet aroma to the Lord. Then you shall sacrifice 1 kid of the goats as a sin offering, and 2 male lambs of the first year as a sacrifice of a peace offering. The priest shall wave them with the bread of the first fruits as a wave of offering before the Lord with the 2 lambs. They shall be holy to the Lord for the priests. And you shall proclaim on the same day that it is a holy convocation to you. You shall do no customary work on it. It shall be a statute forever in all your dwellings throughout your generations. When you reap the harvest of your land, you shall not wholly reap the corners of your field when you reap, nor shall you gather any gleanings from your harvest. You shall leave them for the poor and for the stranger. I am the Lord your God. And so here we have this 4th feast, also known from other chapters as the Feast of Weeks. It's 7 weeks is the idea, and because we see these 7 weeks after the Feast of First Fruits is when it would be celebrated. In Jesus' day, this feast was known as the Day of Pentecost. It's a Greek word, Pentecost, which means the 50th day. And the reason why it was known the Feast of Weeks, or the 50th day, is because it was to occur 50 days from the Feast of First Fruits, which, including the day of First Fruits, making that day 1, 49 days or 7 weeks later, 7 Sabbaths later, was this day. And we see it was a feast to celebrate the springtime harvest. So, 7 weeks after the first fruits budded, the lion's share of the remaining of the spring produce has now come into full bloom and probably just about finished growing. And so it would be a time when they would be gathering all the remaining fruits and vegetables in the spring, except, it says, for the corners of the fields, which they would leave for the poor and for the strangers. And so there was sort of this social benevolence, charitable structure that God was telling them to have. But it was a time of celebrating all, this is where they have all their baskets and they're putting all the fruit and all the veggies in, and, they're canning them and they're, storing them and cooking and all the things. And so there was this great celebration that was to take place. And this feast was to be built around it. So it was a time, you might say, of great fruitfulness, right? It was a time of tremendous amount of fruit coming into their lives. And so they're celebrating and thanking and praising God and worshiping God for this work he has done in their midst. And basically, at the end of the growing season, they would here make an offering again to the Lord. It's an expression of gratitude, expression of praise for his abundant provision, and to celebrate the tremendous fruits that God had given to them. A good thing to do, right? To stop and thank the Lord for his provision, for his fruitfulness in our lives, for the things he's so blessed us with. Every good and perfect gift comes from God, the Bible says. The air we breathe, our daily bread, his capacities to give us the ability to work, and the provisions we have for that. I mean, we are so lavishly blessed. And, so here's this pausing at the end of this season where, yes, they were working and laboring, and yet they see the fruit of it. And they're recognizing God, think about it. Like, you can do all the work of farming, but if the weather's terrible, if there's no rain, if the sun just decided to not come out anymore, you'd have some problems. And so invariably, yes, men were laboring, but it was God who was blessing. And without him, it wouldn't have happened. Alternatively, you can have some places, even in our own church property, we have some wild berries that no one's planted, no one's watering, and yet God made it abundantly grow. So again, just the provision of the Lord, he's done this in their lives. And here's this time of great fruit in gathering where they're recognizing, wow, look at the goodness of God, and they're celebrating him. Well, we want to keep going here. Verse 23 says, Then the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, Speak to the children of Israel, saying, In the 7th month, on the first day of the month, you shall have a Sabbath rest, a memorial of blowing of trumpets, a holy convocation. You shall do no customary work on it, and you shall offer an offering made by fire to the Lord. So notice, first of all, as we get to this fifth feast, we've now come to, it says, the 7th month of the year. And again, this is not July, as our minds might think. This would actually put us, according to the Jewish calendar, in the fall time. So more like September, possibly October. So understand the first 4 feasts were all in the spring. And then these last 3 feasts are actually in the fall. And like the first feasts, these feasts are also going to be grouped together. The first ones were sort of grouped together. These are going to be grouped together. And so here we have the Feast of Trumpets, or as maybe you've heard it called Rosh Hashanah, which, by the way, is considered the civil new year to Jews. So I was trying to understand this, and maybe someone more better than me can explain this later on. But the religious New Year in the Jewish mind starts in the spring, but their quote-unquote New Year's Day celebration was in the 7th of the month, Rosh Hashanah. I don't want to confuse you, but they have a second beginnings celebration, and it has something to do with being tied into, it's believed that creation in Genesis began on this day. So either way, what is it? It's a celebration of the beginning of the fall gathering of crops. So I don't have much personal working knowledge about this. I had to Google and learn from people like my wife and people here who have sort of the green thumb. I don't. But likely there are 2, especially in that day and age, 2 major times in which fruits and vegetables bear fruit in the year, right? In the springtime, we get all sorts of fruits and veggies. Like in Florida, we have berries and tomatoes and peppers and eggplant and carrots and other things. You can ask people who know about that stuff. I just eat it and it's good. And many of you already, I'm sure, planted your spring gardens with all those delicious fruits and veggies that you are planning to have this spring. And you're wondering, is it going to freeze again? Like, when's it going to stop this year? Right? It's just crazy. But in the fall, you can also plant fruits and vegetables, or you already had early in the year, and yet they're a completely different set of fruits and veggies, right? So you get more of the lettuces in the fall, like the kales, the dark lettuce greens. For us, oranges are mostly fruiting, at that time of the year. Corn gets harvested in the fall, things like that. One of the big ones is wheat, right? And so that's another common thing in the fall. And so traditionally for Israel, there would be 2 reaping seasons. They'd have the spring harvest, and then they would have the fall harvest. And so all the fall reaping and all of its celebrations began with this Feast of Trumpets, where they would blow a shofar, a ram's horn, which I have one in my office. They can get 3 feet long. They're pretty amazing. They would blow this horn at the beginning of the 7th month, which would essentially, through blowing it, initiated these 7th month feasts. Now, something kind of quirky about this, and yet really interesting about this, is when actually this feast was celebrated. Again, remembering the months were based off of the lunar calendar, remembering that the lunar cycle is about 29 and a half days long. So sometimes it's 29 days later you'd start a new month. Sometimes it's 30 days later, depending on when exactly you can start seeing the first sliver of the moon after the new moon, and what time of the day that happened would determine when the next month started. So what day the exact month started was not always completely clear and predictable. It could have been, just at the cusp of 29 or just at the cusp of 30. And you kind of just had to, they didn't have the algorithms and math and all that we can now and say, oh, we know exactly when it's going to happen every moment. They didn't calculate that. They had to watch and see. In fact, it actually, history tells us that part of their determining the first of the month, they would have at least 2 people agree that they witnessed, yes, the moon is now being seen again, thus starting the new month. And so that was 2 witnesses were required to confirm this. Now, why am I bringing all this up? Well, of all 7 feasts, the Feast of Trumpets is the only one that started on the first day of the month. So for the rest of the feasts, all 6 of them, once the first of the month was determined, they would be able to tell how many days until the feast began. When they found out, okay, the first of the month has begun today, they can now take their calendars and say, okay, 14 days from now, let's say the first month of the year, we know we're going to celebrate Passover. And 15 days from now, the unleavened feast is going to start. And so they would be able to sort of count the days, from when the first of the month began. But the Feast of Trumpets, people could have a general sense of when it would start. Is it going to be Thursday? Maybe. Is it going to be Friday? Maybe. But the exact day would not be known because they could not establish it until the actual day in which the moon appeared. And then at that point, the trumpet blowers would blow the trumpets, and that would sort of be the announcement to the Israelites, signifying the day of the Feast of Trumpets had come. And so it's interesting, this feast over time had a nickname. It's been known at times as the Hidden Day. And it's also been known the day and hour which no man knows. Super interesting, right? Really fun fact, and we'll maybe unpack the significance of that in a moment. But let's just keep going here. Verse 26, and the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, also the 10th day of the 7th month shall be the day of atonement. It shall be a holy convocation for you. You shall afflict your souls, and offer an offering made by fire to the Lord. And you shall do no work on that same day, for it is the day of atonement, to make atonement for you before the Lord your God. For any person who is not afflicted in soul on that same day shall be cut off from his people. And any person who does any work on that day, that person I will destroy from among his people. You shall do no manner of work. It shall be a statute forever throughout your generations in all your dwellings. It shall be to you a Sabbath of solemn rest, and you shall afflict your souls on the 9th day of the month at evening. From evening to evening you shall celebrate your Sabbath. So here we have this sixth feast, the Day of Atonement, or as it's known, Yom Kippur, which is the day to atone. And it's another prominent feast that I'm sure most of us at least have heard of before. The Day of Atonement is widely considered the most holy day of all the feasts. And again, this was a day of fasting, not feasting, because it was a day, as we read, in which they were to afflict their souls. Now, we actually spent a good amount of time talking about this back in Leviticus 16, so I'm not going to chase it too much. But remember, this was a day to be a day of mourning, a day of contrition, that they were to be contemplating their own sinfulness and to, in essence, feel the shame and the guilt of their sin, and that as they were at that place, that they were to seek God's atonement, to seek God's covering of their sin as they confessed it to him and repented of it. This was also the one and only day of the year, remember, in which the high priest would enter into the Holy of Holies to seek atonement for the people, that he would put the sacrifice, sprinkle the blood of the sacrifice of the goat upon the Holy of Holies, the Ark of the Covenant, the mercy seat, to seek God's atonement. Remember, this was also this very special offering that was unique to this day, in which they would take 2 goats being selected, and then one was chosen to be sacrificed, as it would, in essence, bear the judgment of the people's sin. The other one, the scapegoat, was, remember, released into the wilderness, and symbolically it was carrying away the sins of the people, and they were set free. And through this ceremony, though people, throughout the year could offer sin offerings and trespass offerings and seek atonement from God, it was this celebration which provided atonement for all of the people. It was a national atonement for all of the nation of Israel. And in a sense, it was this ultimate atonement. It was this final judgment upon whatever sins they had committed in the year past. That it was all being dealt with and judged, and they'd be restored with God relationally, celebrating this day. It was a time when they would be fully restored as God's people again with him. And so that was the Day of Atonement on the 10th day of the 7th month. And then 5 days later, we read of the final feast, verse 33. It says, Then the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, Speak to the children of Israel, saying, The 15th day of the 7th month shall be the Feast of Tabernacles, for 7 days to the Lord. On the first day there shall be a holy convocation. You shall do no customary work on it. For 7 days you shall offer an offering made by fire to the Lord. On the 8th day you shall have a holy convocation, and you shall offer an offering made by fire to the Lord. It is a sacred assembly, and you shall do no customary work on it. These are the feasts which you shall proclaim to be holy convocations: to offer an offering made by fire to the Lord, a burnt offering and a grain offering, a sacrifice and drink offerings, everything on its day, besides the Sabbaths of the Lord, besides your gifts, besides all your vows, and besides all your freewill offerings which you give to the Lord. Also on the 15th day of the 7th month, when you have gathered in the fruit of the land, you shall keep the feast of the Lord for 7 days. On the first day there shall be a Sabbath rest, and on the 8th day a Sabbath rest. And you shall take for yourselves on the first day the fruit of beautiful trees, or the foliage of beautiful trees, branches of palm trees, and the boughs of leafy trees, and the willows of the brook. And you shall rejoice before the Lord your God for 7 days. You shall keep it as a feast to the Lord for 7 days in the year. It shall be a statute forever in your generation. You shall celebrate it in the 7th month. You shall dwell in booths for 7 days. All who are native Israelites shall dwell in booths, that your generation may know that I made the children of Israel dwell in booths when I brought them out of the land of Egypt. I am the Lord your God. So finally we have the Feast of Tabernacles, or Feast of Booths, as it's called. The word tabernacle can be translated booth. And what do we see here? Well, it was also a week-long celebration. It was one in which everyone would come out of their homes, and essentially they would take branches and leaves and all sorts of things like that, and they would build these temporary shelters. They were kind of like pergolas, or perhaps maybe like a tent or like a hut of some form. And they would actually they would stay in these tabernacles, these booths, for a week, and it was a feast. They would celebrate. And in verse 37, they would offer sacrifices and worship to God. Verse 38, they would bring gifts. Verse 40, they were to be rejoicing. Verse 41, it was a celebration. So of all the feasts, this one was noted to be one of the most joyous of them. And we see the reasons why in the verses explained here. Verse 43 says, again, this was to be in remembrance of the Exodus. So in Exodus 12, when Israel fled Egypt, the first place we read that they stopped was